Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here today for Live from the Studio with Pebofatso Mokoena and Nura Ali as part of the Worldings International Residency Exchange. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Griffin Art Projects is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Musqueam, and Stolo nations, and we are honored and grateful to undertake our work here. Okay, so I'm really delighted and grateful to be introducing you to Co-Salish Master Carver of the Squamish and Kwalgut Nations, Xwalacktun, who will be opening this virtual gathering with a song and a welcome. So thank you so much, Xwalacktun, for your time and your generosity and for being with us here today. And I will pass it right over to you.
Okay, thank you. Jazz, Musqueam. Big hands up to you all for joining us here. What I want to do is welcome you with a greeting song, and this is more from my mother's side of the family. So here it is. Yo, yo, hea, wo, ho, hea, wo, ho, hea, yo, hea, hoo, hea, hea, wo, ho, hea, wo, ho, hea, wo, ho, hea, yo, hea. Yo, hea, wo, ho, hea, wo, ho, hea, yo, hea, hoo, hea, hea, wo, ho, hea, wo, ho, hea, wo, ho, hea, yo, hea, hey, yo, hea, wo, ho, hea, oh, oh, hey, 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 big hands up to you all. Big welcome to you all. Thank you, Jazz.
Thank you so much, Xwalacktun, for creating this wonderful opening for today's virtual gathering. We really so appreciate your time and your warm welcome. I also wanted to mention that Xwalacktun is, of course, part of the Worldings residency cohort, and he delivered an artist talk along with Josephine Lee last weekend. So thank you so much, Xwalacktun, for opening this second event as part of the Worldings virtual residency series. To provide a little bit of context, the Worldings Residency Series is an initiative offered in partnership with the Bag Factory in Johannesburg, South Africa. And it has been taking place throughout the month of August and will continue throughout September 2021. It's a residency opportunity that has connected Canadian artist Nura Ali, who will be presenting today, alongside Canadian artist Josephine Lee, who presented last week, and Xwalacktun, who also presented last week. And it has connected these Canadian artists with Johannesburg-based artist Pebofatso Mokoena, who will be presenting today, along with Lebo and Wezile, who will be presenting next weekend. And so these artists have been connecting over the course of an intensive 2-month creation period. And as I mentioned, today is the second of the 3 Live from the Studio events featuring these artists. Now, before we jump in, I just have a few super quick housekeeping notes. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again here because I wanted to mention that if you would like to see live captions displayed for today's presentation, you can enable this by selecting the CC Live Transcription button at the bottom of your screen. I always mention that it's not perfectly accurate and it tends to be a little bit more tricky in terms of names, but we do hope that it is accurate or helpful in capturing most of what we are saying today. I also always mention that we are live streaming today's Zoom event on Griffin Art Project's Facebook page. So if for whatever reason you're experiencing any technical difficulties with the Zoom interface, you'll also be able to follow along this live event on Griffin Art Project's Facebook page. And lastly, I always just mention that we are in webinar format today, and that just means that we cannot see or hear audience members, but we would be delighted if you got in touch with us using the chat dialog box at the bottom of your screen. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear where you're joining from today. And I also wanted to mention that there will be a time for audience questions at the very end of today's presentation. You either can ask your question out loud, so if that's your preference, you can raise the yellow virtual hand at the bottom of your screen, and I can actually go ahead and unmute you. It's always really wonderful to hear from audience members directly. But I do mention that we are recording today's event. So if you choose to ask your question out loud, your voice would be captured on that audio recording. You can also type your question in the Q&A dialog box, which I always point out it's actually separate from the chat. And that's where we'll be checking for the Q&A portion of today's presentation. And if it's your preference to type your question, I will very happily read your question out loud to Pebofatso and Nura. Okay, so that is my housekeeping notes for today, and I'm really delighted to be introducing both Pebofatso and Nura. To give you just a brief overview of the structure of today's event, each artist will be delivering back-to-back presentations, and then they'll have the opportunity to respond to one another, ask each other questions, and at that time we'll also, as mentioned, be opening it up to audience questions. So Nura will be presenting first today. She'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then Pebofatso will present second. And Pebo has actually graciously provided a pre-recorded presentation, which just helps mitigate the risk of load shedding and internet cutouts. But Pebo is with us here today, and he will be present for the Q&A session at the end as well. So I'm really delighted to introduce our first speaker, Nura Ali. Nura Ali is a visual artist, community organizer, and social activist living and working in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Her multidisciplinary practice is deeply rooted in investigating the linguistic scaffolding upholding the construction of race and the valid verbal and textual strategies that perpetuate white supremacy. Nura is deeply invested in strategies to dismantle oppressive structures, and for this reason became one of the founding members of the Vancouver Artists' Labor Union, a unionized workers cooperative with a mission to transform labor practices within the art sector in order to create fair, equitable, and sustainable working conditions for artists and cultural workers. So thank you so much, Nura, and I will pass it right over to you.
Good morning. I'm just going to start my screen share and just get this going. So I'm not going to give you guys too much of a preamble because I know that there's a lot to get through in a very short amount of time. The only sort of quick preamble that I will give is that I'm going to show 4 works that are still under construction and they're still mid-making. And then if there's time at the end, I will try to do a quick reading from my book that's about to be published at the end of this year. Okay, so let's just launch in. So in this work, which is kind of the same for a lot of the work that I do, it came about as a result of various experiences that I personally had that left me feeling a little sticky and a little weird. And so my go-to for any of those kinds of situations is to try to work through it in my work. And so how this came about was that last year I was trying to trace the ways that Black has been linked to all things negative, and specifically trying to do it through literature and the ways that similes and metaphors are used in order to be able to construct this version of Blackness. And I was having several conversations with several white friends, and I kept coming across a certain version of the story. And when I heard, the third version that was kind of like along the same themes, it started to make me think about how to process this. So what it was is that I was talking about my own subjective experience of how it felt to read all these things and how that was living in my body. And I was being given a sort of knee-jerk quick retelling of the story where it was sort of positioning the origin story of how Black became linked with Black as non-racist. And so the sort of Cliff Notes version is that Black is linked to bad, not because of any sort of racial intention, but it's linked to bad because of back when human beings didn't have electricity, people were linking Black to bad because of a fear of the dark. And, I mean, in this, I don't honestly believe that version of the story could even be factual, because there's tons of cultural events that happen at night. When the moon is out, it's actually pretty bright. There's lots of beautiful things about the night. So it wasn't like I swallowed that story wholeheartedly, but what interested me was unpicking how that linguistic sidestepping was happening in order to be able to ignore evidentiary proof and realign the story with white innocence. And so what I realized is that we were having a conversation about lexical semantics. So lexical semantics is just essentially the study of the meaning of words. And words have meaning in two different ways. One is the denominative, which is just the literal meaning of a word. And the other is the connotative. And I think a lot of people do understand how those two things function. But what was interesting to me was seeing how the focus on the denominative, the literal, Black is associated with bad because of a fear of the dark, is a way for words to be able to perform the function of white supremacy. Words are able to hold all of the connotative aspects and all of the associative meanings of the word, while still being able to retain that plausible deniability. And so it's a way for like a way of linguistically turning the focus slightly away from what's actually happening. And by focusing on the literal, it's a way of rendering systems that are incredibly intentional and that are set up with a purpose in mind as being, arbitrary or coincidental and thus neutral. And so for me, when in all the works that I do, I try my best to not just have it be some kind of intellectual thought exercise, but use the ways that I'm thinking about or the ways that I think about what I'm reading and what I'm ingesting in order to be able to apply it to why this matters in the way that we live our lives. And so firstly, it's the fact that there is no such thing as neutral language, that no language is neutral. And we'll definitely get into this more as the presentation goes on, but everything that is presented to us comes from a certain standpoint. And all the attempts to render certain ideologies as being scientific, rational, with this sort of like intellectual distance is just a tactic to be able to mask what active work is happening behind the scenes. And so for me, it's really important to know and understand how this is working, because the way that language doesn't just stay on the page, it doesn't just stay in the things that we hear, it bleeds out into the ways that we think, and it bleeds out into the ways that we behave in the world. There's like this feedback loop between all of these associative links that we're being constantly bombarded with, and the ways that we're able to then extrapolate those ideas into other situations. And so for me, what this is all pointing to is the deep responsibility that we all hold to be able to really understand how we use words, and also to be able to understand how words function in ourselves too, and what kind of impact words have on us. And I was also thinking about in this particular piece, it kind of like walks you through the logic of that sidestepping, where at the top of the page, all of the words and all of these similes and metaphors are actually pulled from the canon. And all of the similes and metaphors used to describe Blackness are things that are actually Black in real life. And so in that top corner, you can sort of rest easy in that coincidence argument. But as you move down towards the bottom of the page, then you're kind of confronted with the ways that, even if that theory of the origin story of Black being connected to bad is this literal fear of the dark, even if that's true, how it functions today, how it functions right now is not that anymore. And so it kind of confronts you with the fact that not only is there an intentional setting up of Black as bad, but then the ways that it's set up is to link Black to all things monstrous and evil. And so in the piece itself, it seems like there's a lot of trying to categorize Blackness, or trying to pinpoint Blackness, or trying to pin Blackness to something, and Blackness itself is like absent. But it's kind of it's not absent, it's just hiding in plain sight. And so all of the markings that you see between the actual words are not just like abstract patterning, they are in fact Morse code. And so I was also thinking in this piece about how that desire to know Blackness, or to pin and fix Blackness, is a part of a larger conversation, both around coded language and around pattern recognition. And so, you know, in one sense, all language is code, and all language is coded language. So I was trying to sort of use the logic of coded language to be able to talk to the ways that pattern recognition works both in two ways. On the one hand, pattern recognition is used by white supremacy in order to be able to fix and hold steady the Black body for observation, in order to be able to control, police, and surveil it easier. And on the other hand, coded language is also used by Black communities and communities of color in order to be able to sidestep that surveillance, and to be able to maintain an interiority, as well as it's like this act. It's a dual act of resistance, but it's also an act of self-preservation. And so we can kind of think about the fact that Blackness is only present as coded language, as a first line of defense in sort of blocking that probing into Blackness in order to be able to fix it to the narrative of, you know, Black is bad. And if then somebody is able to realize that this is Morse code, and they're able to break the code, then Blackness falls into another line of defense, which is like a second cipher, or a second code. And then the Blackness that ends up being translated is partial and glitchy and untranslatable. And so it will just read like blah, 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 or like blah, blah, blah. It kind of doesn't give that satisfactory knowing of a totalizing Blackness. And so because it remains in this sort of like glitchy, partial way, it remains both untranslatable but also ungovernable. And so I really like the idea of using the logic system of pattern recognition and the ways that it's being used against Black people in order to be able to jam up those systems. And so and then I give like a bunch of false flags and red herrings. And so when somebody is attempting to try to probe into Blackness and Black communities in order to be able to formulate a theory of totalizing Blackness, in this work, they're sort of like led on a series of wild goose chases. And so they will constantly be in that process of trying to translate. And each time that they are one step closer, Blackness kind of hops away. And so all that remains in the end, all that remains legible in the end is on the two sides, the evasive tactics that white supremacy uses in order to be able to maintain its innocence despite what it's actually actively doing, and also a stark unveiling of the motivations behind this trying to probe to confirm rather than to know. Okay, and then in this second one, I was thinking about several things for this piece. I was kind of extending this idea of the binary, and realizing that all systems of supremacy are based on this logic system of oppositional binaries, where there is two fixed categories and that they are nothing alike, and that they are the opposite of each other. You know, like woman weak, man strong, gay unnatural, straight natural, or you know, like all of those like versions of supremacies are based on this oppositional oppositional binaries, and that setting up of oppositional binaries is an intentional move in order to be able to like hoard power, wealth, and privilege, and be able to formulate a way of legitimizing one group's right to rule. And so, you know, this binary system of, you know, in like computing, where you have a 0 and a 1, and a 0 is a 0 and a 1 is a 1, and they're not interchangeable, they're like two distinct, discrete groups, has been used by, you know, systems of supremacy to kind of, reinstate that idea of the naturalness of one group presiding over another. However, it's kind of like all about which version of the story you choose to believe in. And in quantum computing, there is a measure of unit that is different from the binary digit, which is just 1 and 0. In quantum mechanics, they have in quantum computer, they have what is called a qubit. And so a qubit, unlike the binary digit, it has the probability of being both 0 and 1 simultaneously. And then it becomes, it's a final state through an interaction with other qubits. And so if you have two qubits, each one is able to be both 0 and 1 and 0 and 1 at the same time. And then when they interact, this one becomes 1 and this one becomes 1 through that interaction. And so I feel like this is a much more useful way of being able to understand not only how language works, but also like how people become, how we sort of begin to understand ourselves and our relationships to other people. Because when words are not just fixed in meaning, and the desire to remain focusing only on the denotative aspects of words is that way of linking words to the binary, to that racial binary, to all binaries that supremacy is kind of founded on. And so I like thinking about this idea of how in a qubit, its state is not independent or fixed, but it is interdependently constructed and is determined by that interaction. And so in this piece, and I use this a lot in a lot of my other works, I try to use the visual language of all of these things that I'm trying to unravel and think through. And I use the visual language specifically because it does such an interesting thing. It does something that I think is able to do sometimes with words, but it's kind of a way of using the visual language to be able to graft on something that is a fiction with this sense of like authority and legitimacy and neutrality. And so, you know, if we think about things like charts and graphs and tables and pie charts, these are, in a sense, the visualization of like the lab coat effect, where it imbues it with a certain kind of scientific detachment, but actually none of it is in any way detached. And so this chart that you're seeing is a phonetics chart that, excuse me, is trying to show the correct ways to pronounce vowels in English. And so I'm thinking through how, you know, the sort of like the rigid scientific approach to be able to map this like correct version of speaking English is directly linked to all of these other bigger and broader conversations around supremacies. And so when you think about standardized English, or when you think about correct spelling, or when you think about all of these ways of creating uniformity in language, it isn't that they went out and like did a survey of how people were using language all over the country, and then from that formulated a standard English. Each attempt to create these like fixed and unmovable systems are in and of themselves coded with the group that did that endeavor. And so when it comes to, I'm not sure this is so true in Canada, but it 100% is true in England. Vowels are one of those particular things that are able to immediately pinpoint somebody in terms of their like ethnicity, in terms of their race, in terms of their gender, in terms of their sexuality. And so formulating a way of creating this mutual seeming correct pronunciation of vowels is actually a way that these groups are able to then use that as these gatekeeping and policing tactics. And so it's really interesting to see how we can, once we start to understand that there is all of these other stories outside of this big story that presents itself as the only, like there's a right and a wrong. People have been using language in all kinds of ingenious and intuitive and innovative ways, and different communities, especially communities of color, have been using language in all of these different facets. And so when I was like playing around with this chart, what I was kind of thinking of is that I'm, in a sense, doing a bit of a jailbreak. So all of the different aspects of the chart, all of the little dots that used to be contained within this rigid lattice have now all been broken free. And now they're able to operate in the ways that language actually does in real life. And so I was thinking about how these so okay, in linguistics, there's like in a sentence, you're able to break down the sentence into smaller and smaller parts. And like the smallest part of a sentence is called a syntactic atom. And it's essentially just like a fancier word for saying like a word or like a prefix or a suffix. And I really like this idea of syntactic atoms because I think that words actually do operate closer to atoms than they do in that they have a certain momentum, motion, and like velocity to them. And so it kind of takes it away from the original like computer binaries where it's like there is a right and a wrong, into the qubit where it's able to hold possibility of being either or, and it only becomes its original, it's like final meaning in that sort of interaction. And then it also is changed by every other interaction with every other syntactic atom. So I really think that this is a better way of thinking about how language works in the world and how language works on us, where all meaning is this relational and referential thing where it's completely determined by what it's interacting with. And so there's no such thing as independent meaning, as there's no such thing as of like independent, like words having this like essentialist or deterministic meaning, but that they're all created interdependently. And then I was also thinking about this other idea of how we can also start to think about the grid as each box having a different spatial region. And so in quantum physics, the spatial regions are like space that provides the objects that move through it with different degrees of freedom. And so when an object passes through it or moves through it, its velocity, its momentum, its trajectory, its direction are all changed by that interaction with that space. And so we can think about these different sort of boxes as maybe like different grand narratives or maybe different systems of supremacy. And so all of those atoms that were initially charted as being these like fixed right and wrong now are shown to be both impacted by the other atoms that they are interacting with, but also within their positionality in that spatial region. And so in my mind, I always think about it as like the spatial regions as having different materials that they're made of, and like one being made of porridge and like one being made of honey, and then the other being made like baked beans, that when you move through it, how you're able to move through it completely changes. So I was thinking about how to then link this idea of the breakdown of this oppositional binary way of looking at things to this new multiplicities, simultaneous multiplicities, and thinking about how to link that idea to professional sports. And this work, I was kind of doing it around the same time as Simone Biles decided to not continue with the Olympics, and it reminded me back to Colin Kaepernick last summer. And I was trying to think through the idea of how in the racial binaries, where there are two distinct categories, a Black person is only able to switch categories or like switch genres, as Sylvia Winter says, through that bridge of exceptionalism. That switching from one to the other is conditional, and it's on the condition that it's on the condition of the continued performance of excellence, but it's also on the condition of never critiquing or criticizing any aspect of this new group that you belong to. And I was like thinking back to the conversation that I was having about how you're able to talk in the connotative, talk in all of these associated meanings, but then when you're kind of called out on it, you're able to switch back to the denotative or the literal meaning in order to be able to sidestep the responsibility that comes with the words that you've actually used. And I was thinking about how all of these, the ways that both Simone Biles and Colin Kaepernick were being talked about were just so strange, because there was words like unpatriotic and ungrateful that were coming up. And so I thought that this would be like a nice way to be able to kind of flip that story in its head, where on the front of the gymnastics leotard, there's the word goat, which is Simone Biles' kind of both her motto and her something that she's like forcefully claimed, which goat just means like greatest of all time. And then the ways on the back where it's the chart that now allows for the ways that communities of color are using language in these like innovative and poetic and like incredible ways, and that sort of multi-textualness of the ways that they are able to claim that their own version of speaking that isn't like now, you know, like you're not speaking well, but it's actually just like a whole different way of approaching language. In this one, I was kind of continuing my thinking around the use of these visual coded language of all of these like charts and graphs and ways of like imbuing a particular fiction created by a particular group and that transition of that fiction into that fact through this like visual representation. And so what I was trying to do was like, I was using an algorithm. So an algorithm is essentially a series of instructions that are supposed to solve a problem when it's carried out in like a particular order. And I was using an algorithm that I created myself in order to be able to solve the oppositional binaries in these like linguistic charts and graphs and bar charts. And so what I was trying to do was take these very sort of like static and fixed, you know, deterministic ways of approaching language, and then make that information begin to behave as a qubit does, where each new configuration, each new thing that comes about is as a result of its interaction with like between like 2 or 3 or more charts. And so I was trying to think through the idea of how there's no real sense in us trying to fit ourselves into systems that are just wrong from the get-go, that they are, you know, all of these efforts to try to reform a system is like, at some point you have to realize like, this is beyond saving. This is not something that we should be investing this much time into trying to prop up and keep and like make better. Sometimes it's, you just have to know when to call the time of death and begin again. And so I don't really believe that there is a need to throw away everything, but I was thinking of it more as a way to try to break it all down until what remains are more useful fragments that are able to operate as qubits do with this simultaneous possibilities. Okay, and then lastly, so this one is going to be a 7-foot long banner that has these two panels of chiffon that are printed, and then when they're hanging, they're able to be like very legible when there's no interaction between the banner and the room, but then when somebody walks past it, or when the door opens and there's a draft, then they sort of like move against each other, and then they kind of go into this like in and out of focus, and it's really kind of awesome. So in this one, I was trying to think through the idea of bibliography as activism, and thinking about the word activism in like this dual sense, where on the one hand, it is about trying to provide different sites of knowledge, where all of these sort of systems of oppression and systems of supremacy that try to prove that their version of this oppositional binary is the only version. I quite often use bibliography as a way to be able to counter that narrative and be able to say, like, if some ideas are useless and wrong, and if some ideas don't work, we don't have to stick to them just because that's the way that things have always been done. We could throw away ideas that don't work and look for new sites of knowing. And so that's kind of the first way that I try to think about bibliography as activism, and trying to myself intentionally disseminate these other ways of knowing. And then the other side of this bibliography as activism is trying to think about ways to orchestrate an audience member having to go and engage in an active activism. So it's kind of linked to the first work, where it's this assumption of access into a Black interiority, or an assumption of access that comes with white privilege. And so for me, when you see the names of all the authors, they're only part of the name. And that move was intentional in order to be able to force the person who's coming in, who wants to read these books, to themselves do something. Like it's like, I've done my part, and now it's the audience's chance to step up and claim their responsibility to be able to educate themselves. And so I was thinking about this like active activism, how anti-racism is a verb, it's not a noun, it's something that has to be, it's effortful. And so I was trying to think about how, there's no such thing as a passive spectator, that even in your belief of passive, like being passive means you haven't done anything, that in and of itself is a choice. And so either they'll have to confront their own willful remaining in passivity, even though they are claiming to want to engage in activism, or they'll be forced to be able to do their part and step up and like actually take on that that responsibility. If you want access to this scholarship and this expertise, it doesn't come for free. Like, you have to go and do something to earn it. And I was also riffing off of Colleen Smith did a series called Reading List, and she proposed this idea of the bibliography as armor, and I really like that idea of how it can be it could be ways for us to find spaces for us to like rest our bodies, but then also protect and arm our bodies to formulate shields from the spaces that these authors are able to create for us. And so I definitely think of the bibliography as an act of care, where if I've discovered an author, an author of color that I really like and who's profoundly changed the way that I think about things, the first thing I do is give it to everyone and anyone that I come across and know, as this way of being able to yeah, provide them with these little chinks of armor as well. Okay, so I think we're gonna have time for a quick read of, oh dear. I'm going to stop my video for just 1 second while I find the draft of the book. I had it, but then I forgot I exited it. So I'm just going to find the draft of the book. And what I'm going to try and do is do a reading of one of the first sections, and then also do a reading of one of the last sections. And so when it comes to the book, it was kind of my way of being able to start to use writing as a way to think through all of these interactions that I'd been having as I was going through art school. And okay, here we are. So it was, there we go. Now, so art school was a bit of a strange experience in so many different ways, but one of the things that was the most startling to me and the most jarring was I don't think I've ever been racialized on such a daily scope as I was in like those 4 years. And so there was so many, you know, subtle messaging as well as like overt attempts to like present me with one way of being both an artist and a Black artist. And every sort of like version of that story that I was given just was like, oh, no, none of this aligns with any of my values or any of my interests or any of the ways that I want to be a person in the world. And so I knew, even as I was being told those stories, that I could not do this version, but I didn't know what was the opposite, what was on the other side. And so I was trying to use writing as a way to write through and get to the other side. And I realized that now the book is like split into 2 sections, where the first half of the book is me trying to write and name all the places that I couldn't imagine myself living within without dying some kind of death. And then the other is me writing about all of the places that I can't imagine living without. And so I'm just going to do one quick reading from the spaces that I can imagine living within. And so I posed myself this question that said, where can I find a world that is hospitable to me? And I was thinking about the word hospitable in 2 senses, where on the one hand, I was thinking about hospitable as like welcoming, inviting. And then I was thinking about hospitable in its ecological sense of a hospitable environment for a plant to grow, and how plants can grow in inhospitable environments, but they will just end up growing stunted and deformed. And so I was thinking about spaces that are hospitable in the sense that it doesn't allow me to just live, it allows me to thrive as well. Okay, where can I find a world that is hospitable to me? I know that the institution is not made for me. I felt it in the ways that my gut and back clench up when I walk through those doors. I felt it lurking behind those not so innocent questions. I felt it in those excruciating words delivered with casualness, my humanity brushed aside without a second thought. I felt it in the poisonous silences, the side-eyed looks, the avoidances, the put-downs, the condescension, in that deep realization that none of this even pricks their conscience. I've seen it in the endless versions of avoidant shape-shifting, the yeses that mean no, the meeting silos, that we should do something about this Groundhog Day that lasts decades. I've seen it in the constant bewildered refrain, we don't know how to fix this, which really means we don't know how to fix this without committing any time or money to the problem. Where can I find a world that is hospitable to me? I know that gratuitous depictions of violence enacted on Black bodies is not for me. My humanness is not the agitated compass point bouncing between the dread fury and the perverted desire of white moral panic. The argument goes that white people have been baptized at the river of Lethe for too long, and so we must crack open their sensory deprivation tanks and make them face the devastation they have brought. In touring museum shows and hushed cinema aisles and and university seminar rooms and TV screens and Twitter feeds and campaign speeches and town hall meetings and billboards and bookshop displays, pulverized Black bodies do not look back at us, but are cracked open for us to peer inside. Remorse is the indulgence white people pay to buy their absolution from action. Remorse is that well-fondled dream of redemption. Remorse is what grants them Black bodies as skin parchment for white meditation on the possible humanity of their zombie Caliban, who even in death refuses to die. The Black body resting somewhere between museological specimen and automaton, fleshy yet void of motion and motivation without a white hand pulling those levers. I've seen this in the ways that white people will use shocked outrage as an alibi, a momentary pressure valve release that lets them whoosh back to innocence. At least now we know, they say, their voracious eyes riveted to the pixelated proof that they, thankfully, are not Black. Where can I find a world that is hospitable to me? I thought that Black authenticity might be for me. Black authenticity at first felt like reclamation, a forceful taking back of all that was stolen, a demarcation in the sand saying, this is not for you. We needed a way to separate racism's funhouse mirror distortions from what was truly Black, a self-determined, self-defined actualization of self. I had seen the need for this in white people's mystified hand-wringing about the universality of popular culture, which really means Blackness is our manifest destiny and everything produced by the sweat of a Black brow is our property. I felt it in my dread of swishing blonde dreads, the modern minstrel ready to deliver a convincing Black accent, those twerking white hips slipping on Blackness as their braids slap their backsides. Now I'm realizing that Black authenticity is yet another funnel system with different wardens at the gate, a different set of jailers who thrust at me my lines for their blackface marionette show, handing me the indexical record of sanctified Black do's and don'ts, the implicit warning clear. If you don't follow the rules, we will unmask you for the interloper you are. It had never occurred to me that my blatant Blackness would need authenticating, my tether to belonging casually snipped with a dismissive, you're not really Black though. Where can I find a world that is hospitable to me? I had thought that family might be for me. I did not realize it at the time, but even here there was a subtext to being, to belonging, to being loved. I heard it in my auntie's soft sigh that my sister's beauty was European, her reproachful eyes shifting to my midsummer lacquer, my skin looking like polished hematite. I saw it in the wish fulfillment mixed into a pot of skin bleach, holding our collective desire to leech ourselves away and become ghosts that cannot be pierced by bullets. I read it scrawled across the shrinking flesh of my diminutive cousin, wilted so firmly by the shame of existing. I saw it in my mother's careful hammering of a lattice of respectability around her children, the scaffold pressing tight against our all-slick bodies, her impotent rage poured into this camouflaged hypochondria, those constant unnecessary surgeries snipping away her children bit by bit, the missing buttons, the frayed hems, the unironed shirts sparked a primal panic because they meant her children were not sufficiently disguised to enter the world. We were mounting the same plate as the outside world, but with a much reduced cost and a more modest budget. Oops. Where can I find a world that is hospitable to me? I had thought that social activism communities would be for me. I thought that the enemy of my enemy would be my friend, but here too, the same scaffold upholds the house, the same bodies buried in the drywall. I have seen it in the velocity of the Messiah's alchemical transmutation to pariah and exile from the mountain. I felt it in the pulsating electric current as the group relishes the taste of the first drop of blood in the water and orca-like circles for the hunt. I felt it in that vortex of shaming, the disorienting sudden atmospheric pressure drop localized around the body of the soon-to-be shunned. I have seen it in the ways that unity is code for erasure, the machete on the wall policing and patrolling the borders of our difference. I've seen it in the ways that an entire person is collapsed into an oppression subcategory. Each person must now give a PowerPoint presentation on why they matter most. I've seen it in the ways that the powerlessness of our lives unhinges those Wendigo jaws, the insatiable maws of Kronos, ready to eat his own children. I heard it in the ways that righteousness is used to gild fiefdoms, providing the convenient moral polish to demand absolute allegiance. Actually, don't think I'm going to have time to read the other section. So I think this might be a good place for me to stop. And actually, this is like a little teaser for you guys to get the book.
Thank you so much, Nura. That was incredible. Thank you for your thoughtful and insightful presentation, as well as that reading. May I ask where the book is available if anybody would like to get a copy?
So I think people just have to follow me because it's midway through the final stages of being designed. I'm working with this amazing, incredible designer in Vancouver called Rayhan Yazidi, and she's just phenomenal. So it's still being finalized.
Amazing.
So hopefully we'll have more information on that towards the end of the year.
Great, congratulations. And thank you again for that wonderful reading and your wonderful presentation. Okay, so I'm very delighted to introduce our next presenter, Pebofatso Mokoena. And Pebo was born in 1993 in Ekurhuleni, South Africa, and he lives and works in Johannesburg, South Africa. Pebofatso completed his NDiP in Visual Arts at the University of Johannesburg and his BA in Visual Arts at WITS with distinction. He is currently a lecturer in drawing and interdisciplinary presentation at the Faculty of Art and Design and Architecture at UJ. Pebofatso's work is currently rooted in the relations between micro and macro maps of meaning across multiple environments. Thinking through interdisciplinary modes such as architecture, layering practices, decoloniality, mind mapping, and aesthetics, Pebofatso uses his own personal narratives and a consistent application of experimental inquiry as tools to make sense of and potentially build parallel cosmologies set across a world that in theory is becoming smaller and smaller. So thanks so much, Pebofatso. And as I mentioned, Pebo pre-recorded his presentation. So I will bring that up in just a moment, but Pebo, I am going to spotlight you beside me for just a second, just to say hello. Pebo's here, and as I mentioned, he will be with us in the Q&A as well. So thank you so much for your time tonight, Pebofatso, and for your willingness to pre-record your presentation.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to your questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Pebo. Okay, so I will go ahead and pull up. I'll share my screen here.
Oh, man.
Mokoena, and good evening or good afternoon from wherever you are in the world. My name is Pebofatso Mokoena, and I am going to take you on a deep dive into the Pebosphere. So let's get straight to it. So first of all, this is critical to note that my practice is essentially an articulation of space, and all of the stories that inhabit said space is what I am interested in and is what I always aim to visualize. So whether these stories are from the realm of politics, social politics, economics, architecture, space, motor mechanics, all of these forces which move people in different directions to different countries, different spaces. I am interested in the field that encapsulates all of these narratives. So this is essentially my main practice. To give you a visual, this is essentially how it looks like. And so it's these boundaries, these borders, these limits, these orbits that I'm particularly fascinated by, because they're not static, they're always fixed. And it is this notion that boundaries are never fixed that also allows my work to not be fixed, to not be static. And I think that that's also a very important note to emphasize. And so to the actual work itself, I won't show you images as yet, but some notes to also keep in mind when one sees my work. You always will see a succession of dots. You'll always see either solid or perforated lines moving in and out of the paper or the canvas. One of my signatures is something called a swish, which is a gestural mark of paint, which goes from one end of the canvas to the next. You'll see it pop up quite regularly and in different forms. But essentially, the swish is to describe a certain kind of gestural movement. And that gestural movement is reminiscent of people continuously in motion. It can be people or cars that fly at high speeds, to the point where you can't actually see the form of the vehicle in motion or the person in motion, but you can sense the fact that they're moving through space. The swarm, you'll see that it'll always come from one edge or outside of the canvas inward. One of the things to also note is a heat map and multiple sorts or multiple kinds of circular forms. And so all of these are very kind of simple gestures into trying to understand the complexities of the narratives and the stories at play in my canvases, or in effect in the Pebosphere. And so to the first work, this work is called The Afterthoughts. So what I'm essentially going to do in this the presentation is really trace painting as the base practice, and so, but then doing so through images of drawing and printmaking. One of the reasons why I do this is because my practice essentially feeds. So my drawing feeds into my prints, and my prints feed into my paintings, and my paintings then loop around to feed back into my drawings. So as a continuous loop, you'll see resonances in drawing, in printmaking, and particularly in painting. And so The Afterthoughts then was a work made shortly after my trip in 2018 from Tehran in Iran. And essentially what I was trying to figure out here is, how can I think about movement without necessarily drawing people in movement? And the not so obvious answer came by drawing in mark, drawing in color, drawing in form, just as a kind of meditative means to think about how I've been moving, both individually as a human body, but also as at a very molecular level, thinking about how atoms also continuously move in and out of our bodies. And so, to extend this this idea of movement further, remember all of these images are within the umbrella of thinking about the narratives of movement in the wider umbrella of thinking about space. And so here I was still, in this particular drawing, I was thinking about hearing people moving. So this work was also made in conjunction with the Afterthoughts in Tehran. And again, every single day I would just come in as a meditative practice and actually just begin to figure out, how can I engender meaning in the way that I make my marks, and what kind of composition would that entail. And so then this this kind of daily gesture of making marks, hearing people on the streets, and trying to articulate that in drawing for me was the primary objective for this work. And as soon as I came back to South Africa, I worked with a print studio called DJI Studios in Johannesburg, and we had always had conversations about thinking about if there is a way to translate mark making in drawing and thinking about mark making in print. And so, can these multiple elements then be thought about in print? And so, the results then are, at the current moment, as you see, are three prints titled They Warned Us Years Ago at the top, on the left, political signals, and on the right, a million receipts. And with this, I was just really thinking, and so as a kind of pivot away from the people, I was really thinking about administration that is almost kind of ever present. I was also thinking about this relationship between people and administration, and in a sense thinking about this relationship between colonial administration versus anti-colonial administration. So if someone is not necessarily part of quote unquote a particular kind of system, they are not accounted for, then they're not in the so-called good books of particular kinds of systems, and which has very deep political and social implications, of which I'm not going to get into, but this is where I was engaging with these ideas. But these ideas routinely come back, as you'll see in the paintings, and then from the prints, then I thought about, okay, well, how about we then think about this in painting, as a kind of, can we then begin to gesture, because we've already pivoted from drawing to printmaking, can we then gesture again into painting? I often sense that there's a really close relationship between painting, drawing, and printmaking. Often, if one when one draws quite well, one is able to create really amazing prints, and the same can be said for painting. There is a really close-knit relationship between painting and printmaking, as well as drawing and painting. So there's a very close relationship there that I'm particularly enamored by. And so with these then, yes, they do look a bit Euclidean, but the introduction of the line, which changes color, to me was indicative of, again, how people are able to then shift from one place to the next. It's quite an abstract approach to thinking about line, but often, particularly with the current algorithmic machines, people often tend to trace people's movements, people's past movements through line, and I thought that was a very poignant thought process into thinking about, again, the movement of people within particular kinds of spaces. And then thinking about all of these ideas, then I wanted to pull them together to then start to fundamentally produce intimate worlds within the world on paper. So I sought to see paper or canvas as a limitless world, where there essentially are no boundaries, but then boundaries can be drawn and erased, and then things just start to happen and things start to move within this canvas, which are parallel and conversely not really working on the rules of like the real world, but they function at different frequencies and they function at different time zones and time limits and orbits and years, and then just being aiming to produce different kinds of worlds on a two-dimensional surface as paper. And so to get through and so as I started building this world, then particular elements began to come back. So there's that perforated line perpendicular to the vertical line that goes from top to bottom, and then starting to really understand my visual language, but then also starting to try to not to understand fully as a way to open up myself to the possibilities of what I can achieve within the two-dimensional space, thinking about how I can present my work in the 3 dimensions on paper, or the illusion of the 3 dimensions on two-dimensional flat surface, such as paper and canvas. And then again, there is that swish again, the line that changes color, that's always in constant motion. It's never really in one place. These are on the mathematical fringes in the center. There is a triangle reminiscent of the Pythagoras theorem, and just gestures moving in and out of the canvas, or moving in and out of the world on canvas. And so as soon as it just continues, then what then starts to happen is that there are certain artistic processes which I became very interested in. And so Bad Ideas was essentially part of a show called Internal Probes, and this particular work, Bad Ideas, was in essence thinking about slave ships as being bad ideas, and visually rejecting them by crossing them out as bad ideas, to me was quite a revolutionary act, but then also has roots in graffiti, where people tend to tag walls, and then someone begins to tag like over said tag, and so you begin to almost build this layering kind of process, although very very unintentionally, for the for or not for the public. That is a conversation that I'm interested in having further on along my trajectory. And yeah, and so repetitions again, thinking about composition form, and again, this kind of sleight of hand when thinking about slave ships, but then thinking about slave ships as bullets, which kind of run through at very supersonic speeds throughout space, and this kind of idea really resonated with me, particularly when Elon Musk and the Amazon guy, can't remember his name, when they began to fly to space, but then in these like multi-billion dollar spaceships, but then on the ground people were left hungry, and so that gulf between the haves and the have-nots, I was trying to really think about that, and I was trying to quantify how big is that space really, can we even quantify it? I'm still not sure of the answer, but I think I'll get to it quite soon. And so then, and so pivoting away from that, then thinking about then how then can this this limitless space of painting, this limitless space of the cosmic space, how can it be how can it is it able to be filled by multiple elements at play? Um, so there are those dots again. Those dots can be reminiscent of the nighttime sky, or they can be thought about as a series of data points. And so what you then end up with is this conversation between data accumulation practices, data recording practices, and at a very kind of cosmic level in relation to the night skies. And so I think, coupled with that, then things start to happen where you are pulled away from the ground and brought into this cosmic space where one is able to maneuver, shift, and bend, and move with magic clouds, in and out of orbits, in and out of spaces, in and out of swooshes and lines, and all of these other elements, which are quite in fact loaded with meaning. Lines, boundaries, limits, orbits, swarms can be a particular group of people that are moving at supersonic speed from point A to point B, or from point 0 to point 1. And so then the work then begins to grow. And as you can see again, this is the same project at play. So then all of these ideas then are part of a wider thought process about thinking about what happens in these spaces, what are the stories in these spaces, what has happened in these spaces, and what is built on top of certain places. And yeah, again, these are the circular forms. These are the swarms going, particularly in Mars. The swarm is moving into that particular circle, or it can even be called a black hole. And so, there's all of these stories, but then the viewer then is the person who is able to articulate their own stories within the place and the space of these paintings. So the paintings themselves then are places of activation for the viewer who views the work to then imbue their own certain narratives. And just to give you a sense of scale, and this is a work titled Mammals and Their Prodigies, and in a sense, this is just an image just to show you size and scale of work, because now what is then beginning to happen in my process is that the works are becoming bigger, not only physically but conceptually too. And so like the spaces that one or that the viewer begins to inhabit then stretches out of the limit of a viewer's field of vision. And so this is where I end. Thank you very much for listening to my talk, and thank you.
Amazing. So thank you so much, Pebofatso, for that incredible presentation and for taking us through your research and your practice, and for sharing those amazing visuals as well. It's so exciting to get a close-up look at your paintings, your drawings, and your prints and how they relate to each other. So thank you so much, Pebofatso. I'd like to invite Pebo and Nura to join me back here. So I will spotlight each of you here. Awesome. And I would like to now just open it up to a more conversational aspect of the presentation. So Nura, Pebo, I'm sure you have some questions for one another or responses. I'd also like to invite the audience to join in on the conversation. So as I mentioned, please feel free to raise a virtual hand if you'd like to join the conversation and be unmuted, or feel free to type your questions into the Q&A, and I'm very happy to read those out loud as well. But for now, I'll pass it over to you, Nura and Pebofatso, and I'll be in the background just moderating that Q&A with the audience.
Awesome. Is there any question you want to get started with, or?
I was kind of hoping that you would have a question.
Well, it's more of I have more of a thought than a question, because I was like really interested in the ways that you're thinking about space, and like even your mention of black holes. And I like recently read an article about how there's like a new understanding for how black holes work. And, you know, there's this idea that black holes are like they suck in everything, including light. And so why is it that black holes just don't keep continuously sucking in the entire universe? And so this is like such a roundabout way to connect it back to your work, but there is a connection. So like the new thing that they realized is that even though black holes appear from the outside to have this like static volume or size, black holes do this interesting thing where what they do is their expansion is not out but in. And so what they do is that they are able to grow in size inwards, but they do it through an increase in complexity. And so I was kind of thinking about that as I was looking at both your paintings and the prints and the ways in which you're using this sort of the black space of the ground of the painting to be able to do that same gesture of where is the expansion happening?
Yo, like, A1. I think so. I think with the black background, what I was trying to think about was whether or not that two-dimensional space. I mean, like we see often when we work on paper that space kind of has its limits somehow. And I was trying to kind of reverse that and trying to see whether or not that two-dimensional like flat page or canvas can be like limitless, right? So for example, if this is kind of what you see, if this is the kind of piece of paper that you see, I kind of wanted to do that and then to kind of expand that space and see how wide that space gets. So I think, so in that sense, I don't really know how or at what velocities or speeds that expansion happens, or even if it isn't necessarily expansion, perhaps it kind of is the reverse. And to that end, I think that's kind of what I wanted to do. The question for me is how much information, how much information can I add on to the work to the point where the actual canvas or the piece of paper begins to disintegrate? And to me, kind of like that's where I'm thinking about like this kind of notion of like spaces and spatiality, and trying to be able to spatialize two-dimensional works into 3 dimensions.
And at what point then do you reach that this is enough?
I don't know.
Is it just like an intuitive process of it feeling a certain way?
And I think you've kind of got the same thing happening with your work, is that, you know, it's funny, like when you start to kind of add more things on top of one another, it like you seem like one seems to operate, well, in order to kind of create depth, one has to kind of like continuously like add things on top. and that's kind of the paradox that I often see with the way that you're functioning with language, is that one of like, you're always kind of working in between certain spaces, but you're always in emotional in between certain spaces. You're always kind of carrying like messages to and from places. You know, and
Yeah,
that
I
kind
like
of,
that idea. Like it's almost like I'm like a relay station.
yes, but
Yeah.
like you're like 4 Noras in one race.
Yeah, no, because yeah, it's definitely, because to me, it always feels like the way that I kind of approach language is a continuous series of questions. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think that I ever go into anything that I'm doing with any kind of pre-design or pre-formed conclusions. It's kind of like I'm just following that thread as it leads me down whatever rabbit hole I happen to be in. And you know, for me, I have 6 or 7 rabbit holes on the go at any one time. And so at some point the Warrens do join and they do kind of converge in interesting ways. But I really, I mean, I know that the presentation kind of sounds like I'm like always like shitting on linguistic theory and language, and you're like, it's all rubbish, but I actually do really enjoy the way that words work and the ways that I think it has as much plasticity as other materials do. Like, it has as much sort of like ability to be shaped and ability to constantly be worked and reworked. And I think that, you know, for me, the interesting part of the last 2 years has been when I've always thought that my writing practice and my making practice were 2 separate, distinct things, and that they could never really find a comfortable home with each other. And I've started to now realize that all the ways that I was thinking materially can be applied to all the ways that I was thinking linguistically. And so for me, this has just opened up this whole new playground for how to be able to make words do subtle things, you know, make works be able to perform in the same way that, you know, the body moves in space, or perform in the same way that paint moves on a canvas, and that it has that same, both the tactility and also that mutability and that malleability. So it's, yeah, like I freaking love words. I do.
But also, like, the really kind of intriguing thing that's really happening is that it can also work the other way for painting, right? So like paintings can also speak, I think, you know. So like,
Yeah.
there's like certain kinds of like letters or sounds, you know, but in a sense, I think thinking about linguistics, I often think that my paintings don't necessarily speak, but they tend to sing. Like there's like particular kinds of like hi-hats, notes, drums, bass violin, bass guitar at the same time, and it's like this kind of chorus, you know, with like a kind of choir in the background.
So, but I mean, it's just like operating on a different sonic frequency.
Yeah.
You know, like if language is like on one sonic frequency, it's now sort of more towards that the embodied breath, as opposed to the one used to articulate sounds that mean words.
I think it's possible. Yeah, so straight to the chat. I think we've got like 2 questions and a Q&A.
Okay.
So I don't know.
Yeah, I'll jump on here and perhaps just read them out loud so that everyone can hear the questions as well. We have a question in the chat for Nura, and it's from Wezile, who is actually part of the Worldings residency cohort. So the question is, according to your presentation, Nura, would you say English is a collective of words from neighboring countries? And also, would you say that your writing is influenced by the idea of developing new possible ways of being?
That's a great freaking question. Yeah, I think that, I mean, words definitely language, I should say, it's not, there's no such thing as like it being confined to a particular place or region. It's incredibly porous, and so it's influenced by whoever moves through these different spatial regions. And so for me, the reason why language is so interesting is that it holds the possibility of being able to talk about pretty much every aspect of what it means to be a human being. And so, you know, language can be a way to talk about history. It can be a way to talk about socialization and sociality. It could be a way to talk about all things. And so language definitely is sort of like a constant work in progress, you know, and even the way that certain nouns operate, it could be like when I was like trying to choose what degree I wanted to do the first time I went to university, I really wanted to do etymology and like the study of language, because it's like you can study like art history, you can study philosophy, you can study sociology, you can study every other discipline could be studied through language. For example, like the difference between mutton and lamb. So you know, it sounds like two words to describe sheep, but actually what it is that, you know, at one point England was taken over by the French, and, you know, got a new royal family that were French, that they spoke French in the courts. And so whether or not you use mutton or lamb was whether or not you spoke French or not. And so it was also a sign of your social class. It was a sign of your literacy. It was a sign of that process of colonization. So even in certain nouns, you can have all this like embedded history. And so for sure, yeah, language is in a constant process of being incorporated into all of the different people who move through that space. And even in like Somali, for example, there's a bunch of words that are like Indian words in Somali. And so Somalia had trade links to India and China before they had trade links to Europe and to England. And so it's really interesting to be able to like follow those threads and see all of the points at which different peoples kind of intersected and met through language, and through all of these like little not relics, but like little fragments, these little pieces that remain. And then when I hope that answers the first part. And when I say my ideas are my writing is influenced by the ideas of developing new possible ways of being, 100% yes. That is literally like the entire point and purpose of why I make work at all. So for example, in the book, it was one way of me being able to begin processing, if not this, then what? And being able to use writing as a way to kind of write my way to the then what. But it was also kind of this, it was not intended to just be, like I said before, like an intellectual exercise, that I wasn't just trying to formulate a counter theory. What I was trying to do was write towards what I actually value and what I want to orient myself towards. And so in the writing and getting to the second point of like, this is what I actually value, this is what I want to, this is how I want to orient my life, I was intending to do that process in order to be able to have that as a yardstick, as a way to be able to measure everything else against. And so everything that comes towards me now will be measured against, does it align with these values that I've now discovered, or, you know, does it not? And if it doesn't, then I can say, no thanks, even if it might professionally seem like a good careerist move. I'm realizing that actually, in terms of how I want to rethink my own scale of success, that I've started to realize that there's different parameters that I have for what I would, you know, classify as like a successful life. Like if I was like on my deathbed and looking back, being like, this is a life well lived, and those things don't often align with, or are not the same as having outside accolades and like professional rewards. And so when I'm writing, I'm 100% trying to figure out better ways of being a person, and realizing that in that process of knowing, it's allowed me to find ways to be able to hold myself together in places that want to pull me apart. And so when I am able to really understand at the core of myself who I am and what I believe, then when I come into these situations, there's not that same self-doubt. There's not that same continuous process of like questioning myself in that situation, I can rest solidly there. And so it definitely is a way for me to find ways to be a human in this world, and especially in places that really want to disappear or dissolve my being.
Thanks so much, Nura. We have 2 questions in the Q&A from Lebogang Mabusela, who is actually another one of our Worldings cohort residency artists. So thanks so much for your questions, Lebo. I will read the question addressed to Pebo first. So Pebo, what do you think of mirrors is the question for you.
Yo, I did not expect that one. Thanks, Leo. Whoa, I mean, I think on the one hand, I think that they're extremely, I think that they're extremely distracting. And on the other hand, I think that they, that they can be extremely fascinating, you know? So I think kind of being very, on the point of being very distracting, I think that what mirrors tend to do, and I think this kind of happens at a very kind of subtle level for me, is that they tend to kind of reflect, obviously they're mirrors, but they kind of like reflect like a person's kind of like physical kind of essence, like the way that things look, and not really kind of, you know, the kind of like conceptual or the like psychological kind of like logics behind like the like said objects, right? And so I think that, you know, it, you know, so I think that, but then also like, you know, there are places to like, there are places to check oneself before you wreck yourself. And so, yeah, I think to me, they're kind of operating in this very kind of strange space, you know, like they're not really, well, they're objects, but they're also kind of a way to see, right? They're also a way to think, you know. That to me I think is interesting. That's, yeah, so that's what sort of I think about. I might have to think about that for an additional kind of couple of months and then just come back to you on that one.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Pebofatso. And Lebo's question for Nura. Hi, Nura. Writing in language can embody and show some form or aesthetic. How do you decide on fonts and sizes, etc.? And how do you think of words and texts as beautiful things to look at, especially when overturning the meanings and connotations of Blackness?
In a very quick way, I don't often think about typography as much. I know that there's like some people who are like obsessed with the ways that, you know, this font means classic and clean, and this font means like happy, and this font means, I think that the way that I kind of use font is less about the font itself, size for sure, and the ways that sort of like the text operates on the page. There's some work that I haven't got the chance to show you guys about, because I think a lot through like concrete poetry, and I just got a new book by, oh, his name I can't remember. That's just like blowing my mind in terms of how to think spatially when it comes to words, and I feel like that is my new rabbit hole that I'm just on the brink of falling into, and then I'm definitely going to be like, whoop, yeah. Because I really was not thinking too much about the ways that that text on a page, in terms of like computer generated fonts, can operate. You know, I was thinking about it in terms of like handwriting and the ways that in like that sort of annotation, the redaction, the sort of like addition, the side notes, the marginalia. I was thinking about all of those things when it comes to like handwriting, but I hadn't sort of started to begin to apply that same logic to computer generated text. And this new writer has just like shown me a new possibility that I hadn't like considered before. So that's definitely something that I'm going to be going into further in the next little bit. And I'm already thinking about book number 2 and all the things that, because at some point I just have to finish book number 1. I just have to like call time and just be like, okay, stop reworking, stop editing. Just like these ideas can now go into the next section. And so I think that font and spacing and sizing and layering and overlapping and having those fonts kind of change each other is definitely something that I'm going to be sinking into towards the end. And what was the second part of that question?
Just jumping back on here. So yes, how do you think of words and text as beautiful things to look at, especially when overturning the meanings and connotations of Blackness?
Yeah, so I think that like another thing that I haven't been really able to show you guys is that I do also have a printmaking practice, and I think that I really think about the textuality of words in print more than I do in terms of just like writing on a computer. I think that there's something that happens in that sort of that digital divide that kind of takes me away from the materiality of text. And that's definitely something that I was starting to think about and play with last year when I was using text in print and printmaking. And I was like really riffing off of Chantal Gibson, and she wrote a book called How She Read. And in that book, there's like one section where she's writing what looks like lines, you know, how like if you're like being punished for something, and then does a series of like redactions and erasures, but then the marks remain, and they have these sort of like traces of the previous writing, and then adds and layers them. And then the ways that she was starting to think about this layering as a way, like you were saying, of turning the page from here to here, and it becomes like it has depth. And so I was thinking about that in print in terms of like that possibility that the textuality of print throws up for that, you know, like Amos Kennedy, of like building 3-dimensional space in that text-based layering. So visually, I think that could do something really interesting in terms of like how we think about Blackness, because the 3-dimensionality offers a space to be able to talk about all of the things behind the story, all of the multiple ways of being. That there's no such thing as like one uniform hegemonic Blackness. Like it doesn't actually exist. It's a complete fiction. And so what is important to me is like reintroducing the multiplicity into the conversation, of like taking it away from this oppositional binary and being able to sometimes even use that the sort of the coded language of the oppositional binary to be able to break up the binary, to be able to make the binary shatter a little bit and fragment. And so I think that visually there could be a lot of interesting things with words to be able to talk to that sort of like multiplying, that layering, that sort of expansiveness. And in terms of when I think about Blackness and the ways that text as a sort of like a visually alluring thing, or as something that is like a object in a way, I kind of when I think about words, weirdly, it's not like I'm thinking about sentences as these like sort of like even when I'm writing on a computer, that they're not just like lines on a page that I'm seeing in this sort of like spatial configuration. In my mind, it's kind of like a lattice or like a web, and that there's like all these different nodes that all these different ideas are kind of like intersecting with, and so sometimes I will see 2 nodes that are not connected yet, and I'm trying to imagine how can I get from here to there, and then how can I connect it back to that part of that web, and then in the ways that the words operate, it kind of takes on its three-dimensionality, its font, its size, and its scale in comparison to that link that I'm trying to make. So it's like I'm not thinking about each thing as its own discrete, unique thing. It's like me trying to figure out how, if I have this one idea here and this one idea here, this one idea doesn't have one way of being that idea, and this one idea doesn't have this one idea way of being this idea. It's like in that jump from this idea to this idea, it makes sense for this to be bigger than this. Does that make sense? Like, so that's kind of how my odd brain approaches the visuality of the words themselves.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Nura. We have a question from Griffin Art Project's director, Lisa Baldessera. So Lisa, you should be able to unmute.
Hi there. Thank you so much. It's just been amazing to hear your talks today. And I was just so struck by these spaces, these corresponding spaces in both of your talks, where you talk about certain interdisciplinarity and methodological forms, like really removing yourselves from disciplines and all of the kinds of strictures of the architectures of each of these disciplines. So Nura, when you were talking about atoms and velocity in relation to language, just kind of blew my mind. And Pebo, the articulation of space and the way that you were talking about replacing, using certain kind of semiotics and signifiers and just sort of returning to the mark and the gesture as ways of formulating language for painting, drawing, and printmaking. And I found it fascinating because, you know, you're refuting the binary that you were articulating, Nura, and also, you know, returning to this space of creating, like, as you were saying, discarding things that don't work instead of trying to rehabilitate them. So I just wanted to ask you both to just, you know, maybe comment on it. It's not as much a question, but just an observation of that, how rigorously both of you are working within your practices. I mean, you're still working within these, you know, rich kind of embraces of these things you love about these practices at the same time as creating new architectures for them. So I just wanted to ask you to maybe comment on that a little bit more.
I don't even know where to start.
Oh yeah, well, for me, when I started watching your presentation, I was laughing to myself because it looked like we talked to each other about what things to touch on in our presentations. And there was so many like spooky alignments. And I think that we definitely do have a lot of overlaps in the ways that we both work like interdisciplinarily, and then also think about that there's space for all kinds of different theories to live within the space of our work. Yeah.
Okay. So to me, I think it's one of the reasons I began actually thinking like this is because I often felt that like the external world, like I was always kind of responding to the external world, so like outside of my body. And I thought, well, you know, wouldn't it be fun, but also wouldn't it be saner for me to kind of start communicating internally what I thought was happening in the world, you know, not to say that like what this is wrong, this is right, but you know, I often found that creating spaces or kind of creating fields, architectures, you know, at a very kind of conceptual level allowed me to live in those worlds. And then it kind of allowed me to bend all kinds of conceptual theories in whichever way, you know, like I could dream, you know, and that was kind of, that to me was an approach to my mental health, particularly not necessarily artistically, but to my mental health about how to operate as kind of a more functioning human being and to allow other parts of myself to be like fully immersed in the work that I do, that kind of speaks to the outside world and not always outside world kind of speaking at me continuously. So that's to do. And also, I think I saw a question from Wezile, and I think he kind of asked about like different like spaces. Wait, okay, so Jazz, if you don't mind, I'll read the question out loud. So Wezile says, what kind of spaces initially give you an interest to focus on this kind of practice? And I think the question, I think kind of responding back to Lisa's question, is really trying to find a more peaceful state, a more kind of peaceful space to work from, you know, to kind of start creating like a space, or even like this kind of like garden where all kinds of seeds, all kinds of plants, all kinds of roots, trees, you know, are growing, which then in turn kind of give me kind of like better oxygen to breathe and to kind of create work, you know, to the external world. This is like completely far removed from like all of like the black hole speak.
No, but it's that hospitable space. You're trying to find your hospitable environments that allow you to think and be.
Yeah.
You know, because to me it's so interesting because it's like touching on so many different aspects that I've been really thinking about a lot recently, and like really realizing that, like, I can't remember who was exactly who said it, but it's like, you know, it matters what ideas we use to think other ideas with. You know, it matters what thoughts think thoughts. And so realizing that, you know, spaces are physical and sort of like also ideological, that when we're able to find spaces outside of these ideas that don't make any sense, like, you know, patriarchy or white supremacy or, you know, all of these things, when we're able to find other spaces that tell different versions, that say that propose different ways of being, our ability to think also changes and shifts, and our ability to think ideas are influenced by what is our foundation, what is our jumping off point. And so I think that I was like thinking about how, for like the kind of the space that you've got to is the foundation for you is like auto theory, and being able to use your critical capacities and your ability to formulate links between things as a critical framework for processing all of these ideas that are coming to you. And so it's like, well, who gets to be an authority on information? Who gets to be what would be the right word? Like who gets to be a theorist in this way? And so like I feel like there's so many writers that I've read over the years that only in the last year are their works actually like really starting to make a lot of sense to me. And I think about like, people like Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde and Fred Moten, and how, you know, auto theory has kind of had a white feminist rewashing, where it's being presented as this like new creation that came about with the Argonauts and like Chris Kraus, but actually like people of color have been doing this version of thinking since the beginning. You know, when we're kind of like in certain sort of like institutional ways of thinking are being made aware that there's no space for us here unless we change everything that we are and everything that we believe in order to render ourselves more white. There is no gap for us at all. And so people of color have always been like, well, why am I trying to push my way in here when I can just do my own thing? You know what I mean? Like I can go and like think my own way. And from those sort of like starting from me outwards first has led to so many amazing new conceptions of how to be a person, how to be in the world. And so I like this idea of like, it was like a mental health necessity at some point to be able to do that process of self-naming and self-creating, but that it doesn't seem like it was done in isolation. Like it wasn't, I don't know if it was like just you like how the French philosophers would be like, oh, it's just me in a room by myself thinking, as though that is even humanly possible. Yes, exactly, because I'm a genius and I did it all alone. But then it was like it was a communal creation. This new version of the way that you have for being came about as a result of finding new tethers.
Thanks so much, Nura and Pebo. I know I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I know it's getting to be pretty late for you, Pebofatso, and our South African audience members. But if you're feeling up for it, we do have one more question for each of you.
Okay.
So perhaps we'll wrap up with these two questions. So Pebofatso, I'll start with the question for you, and it's about the boundaries and susceptibility to erasure, movement, spaces. Is there a point in your practice that considers permeability between bodies, stories, and or events in the context of time? If so, how so?
Well, okay. I think that's an incredibly loaded question. I'll try and answer it as simply as I can. Where do I even begin? I think what I would like to kind of draw attention to is this kind of relation between like permeability between bodies. So like that kind of unseen force in between bodies that kind of moves person A to one side, person B to another side with its kind of consequence. I think erasure, is the consequence to the permeability of bodies moving in between. So first, I think, okay, so like say you've got person X. That person X is from, I don't know, the Wu-Tang Clan, right? And then like you've got person Y that listens to like Radiohead, like, or no, Bullet for My Valentine, right? And so that kind of space in between those two people, or like what they want to talk about, but are kind of like fearful of like, you know, this other person wanting to kind of engage, not necessarily about the band or like the kind of like racial kind of classes or anything like that, but just in terms of like the musicality or like the structures of their songs in kind of relation. Like, I think the permeability then stems from either a fear of being able to kind of engage with that person or a genuine excitement to talk with that person about the things that person A and person X and person Y are interested in. And I think that kind of ability to be able to be curious, I think, is like when one is curious, one is then able to erase this kind of permeability, you know, because far too often it kind of feels like it's something that needs to be like disregarded or like we regarded as being awkward, right? But the people who are like genuinely curious often tend to think about it as being an opportunity to learn. And so we would rather kind of occupy that space or that kind of space of permeability. To the context of time, I think that's like a completely different, like, I think that's an incredibly heavy question because I don't know. I mean, I don't actually know like what time it is. I mean, like I can see it on the clock and on the like and on the radio and on the calendar, but I don't really know, you know, like the form of time. I don't know like the structure of time, you know, like like so many readings have been kind of made about time. Like, you know, if I would ask like 6 different people, all 6 would give me like different times. Like it would never be like one exact time. That to me is like frighteningly nerve-wracking. So I don't do that. But the thing is that with these kind of stories in the context of time, I think they correspond again from person X to person Y. So I don't know, it's difficult to kind of engage time with like 60 people at the same time, but it's a lot easier to kind of negotiate that boundary between like one person, or like person X and person Y. I think I hope that helped.
Thank you so much, Pebofatso. And we will end with one last question for Nura. So Nura, in the area of your research and thoughts on literature from people of color, translation and Blackness, code switching to a point of becoming glitchy, etc., how do you think about English literature from people of color who are non-first language users or speakers of the English language?
That's a very interesting question. I think because in a sense, what that work was one facet that the work was trying to unpack was access, and then also like proprietary knowledge. And so that's definitely something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, in terms of like, not all stories are for all people. And the assumption of having everything be available to you is a big part of this conversation. And so, there's so many authors that are, multilingual, that use their multiple languages simultaneously, and make no effort to then translate the other parts that are not, if they're writing in English in another language, to translate the other parts that are not English. Like I'm thinking of like Leanne Simpson and various Indigenous authors who are doing that flip-flop between the two, and that they're able to themselves reject this notion that there has to be a picking of sides, that they have to, do one or the other. That they're like, actually, a lot of people have many intersections, and the sort of being forced to choose sides is something that is externally imposed. And so there's definitely a lot of authors that use their there's another one who's like a Thai author who there's like one particular word in Thai that is untranslatable into English, and then the whole book was like trying to kind of write ways towards that. But then that also, like, there's so many beautiful things that happen in translation, and so many slippages, and so many things that are not quite graspable, that I think it leaves a lot of space to be able to talk about all of the ambiguities inherent in residing in that sort of like the frontier, as Andalusia says. But I think that when it comes to thinking about how I think about this sort of like glitchy and partialness, what I was also trying to do is that it's not the it's that version of Blackness is what will always remain glitchy and partial, because it is something that is never, you will never be able to get to that place of finding a definitive Blackness that these like institutions and these systems of power are trying to root out. That the thing that they're trying to find, this version of Blackness, this definitive Blackness that they're able to then categorize, but then categorize in already like a preconceived idea, will never be able to be found. And so that glitchiness was it's the idea itself that's corrupted rather than the text itself. And so when it comes to like thinking about writers of color, for me, it was, in one sense, it was just like a giant love letter to all the people who've allowed me to find spaces to think differently. But it was also a way of like pinpointing a certain thing that really was super important to me, where part of the reason why I was like so alienated in my art school education was that I was continuously being presented with this one particular white canon this 40 white art heroes. And when it came to the ways that they were thinking about either their own work or like bigger sort of like intellectual exercises, there was still such a insincerity and a disingenuousness that I was finding there, where I would have to, if I liked one aspect of the way that they were thinking, I would have to then actively ignore all of these other things, so if I like your use of color, I have to ignore the fact that you're a pedophile, or if I like the way that you're thinking about what painting could do, I have to ignore the fact that you're beating your wife, or you know what I mean. So it's like I was seeing that for me, theory has to have a purpose. It has to serve a purpose, and I genuinely believe that the theory is intended to provide us ways to be able to understand the world, but then also transform the ways that we behave in the world. And so when you have, theorists who are able to talk about, democracy and freedom and then own slaves, or, talk about like fighting establishment and authority and then go back to their bourgeois life, I was like, that doesn't make any sense. And so when I read certain authors of color, it was providing me a way of crafting a theory that is embodied, that is actually positioned in the world, out of the world and in the world. So it's like a way of, like Dion Brand calls it, like a beating. Theory is a beating practice. So it has a heartbeat. It's supposed to be alive and it's supposed to help you live. And so when I, like a lot of the writers in the banner are the ones who are able to show me this version of incorporating theory with living, and be able to bridge that gap, so that there isn't like a me that and all the things that I believe, and then like a professional me. That there's no such thing as a professional me. That the two things are just one and the same, and that they will be one and the same in whatever avenue or place that I'm in. That there's no divide between what I believe and how I act. And so I hope that answers it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nura. I'm going to jump back on here just to once again say a huge thank you, Pebofatso and Nura, for your amazing conversation, your incredible presentations, your knowledge sharing, and your generosity with your time today. So thank you so much on behalf of Griffin Art Projects. It's been just a delight to hear from you both. And a huge thanks to all of our audience members today. I wanted to just give a quick plug for next Sunday's program, which is our final in this series of the Worldings residency live from the studio presentations. So we do hope that you join us for presentations by Lebo and Wezile, and I'll just go ahead and post the link to the event page in the chat. So we do hope to see everyone there, and hoping everyone enjoys the rest of their Sunday. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
I just want to say, if anybody wants to reach out and continue conversations, I'm up for that.
Amazing. Amazing. Thanks so much, Nura and Pebo. And if anyone is interested, feel free to send an email to Griffin Art Projects and we can facilitate those connections. Amazing. Okay, have a great rest of your day or night, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.